We're live? Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today on the joys of PC building. I'm Rob Boss, and I'm going to show you a little bit about what we do here at AVADirect and the kinds of system builds that we strive to build for all the people that look for happy PCs. I'm joined here by my companion, Mr. Happy Banana.
Hi!
Say hello, Mr. Happy Banana.
Hi, guys!
Mr. Happy Banana is going to help me on our PC building journey today, and on top of the screen in the bottom right, we're going to go ahead and put the kinds of components we're working with. So for all y'all watching at home, you can feel free to grab your own components and join along and build along with us, and we'll tell you a little bit about the kinds of things we do. So let's go ahead and get started and jump into reviewing the case. The case here we have is by Fractal Design, and what we like to do is kind of evaluate the kinds of wire management that we have to work with in these systems before we start to install everything. That way you have a clear direction on the way that you want to go with the wire management going in, so you're not wasting a whole lot of time trying to figure out what you're going to do with those wires.
Yeah, Fractal's actually one of the, at least in my opinion, better manufacturers in terms of cable management space and everything in these cases.
Is that right?
Yeah, they usually have a nice channel in the back, decent cable management mount points, so you really usually don't need a whole lot of extra zip ties and stuff in these builds.
Zip ties are very handy to have just because you don't always have the perfect mounting points that you need to manage those wires, so to be able to have those zip ties and your own creative little mounting points to be as creative as you want to with your builds and make sure that they turn out as great as you want them to. And well, gosh darn it, look at that. Just as you said, own little channel right along here to be able to put all those cables in and manage them properly. And oh, look.
Yeah, and these openings right here really help when you need to plug things into the side of the board, like we're seeing in a lot of USB 3.0 builds. Having channels at that kind of angle really helps out and makes your cables lay kind of nice without having that giant, like, band of cables sitting in the main area of your PC.
Don't know how you'll be able to see it here on the table, the build table, but a lot of manufacturers, what they'll do is they'll include their accessory boxes in one of those 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch bays to be able to discreetly tuck it into the compartment and keep it safe in transit. And in this box, it looks like we have here some screws, some standoffs, spares, of course, some of them not, some needed. And then there's a little standoff tool that you can see. See if I can bring it a little closer to the camera. Little standoff tool, which is pretty useful. Standoff tools are for you to be able to use just a standard Phillips screwdriver and remove standoffs or add standoffs as need be. So it actually looks like we're not even going to need this 3.5-inch drive sled here, Happy Banana, simply because...
Oh, why is that, Joe? I'm sorry, why is that, Rob Boss?
This case actually has built-in 2.5-inch support for mounting right here, as you can see. So what you do is you take this little bay off, held together by a little bit of pressure on one end, mount the SSDs from the inside out, and then you put it back in place. That's a happy little 2.5-inch drive mounting strategy, if you ask me.
No, absolutely.
So now that we see that our wire management is pretty much taken care of due to the design of the Fractal Design case that we're using today, we're going to go ahead and start working with the board and installing the CPU, maybe even the memory and the CPU cooler while we're at it. So, good precaution when you're working with sensitive electronics, obviously, is to make sure you ground yourself. And what we do is we use the trusty old grounding straps, wristbands.
Are you telling me this isn't an ESD banana?
Well, if you want it to be an ESD banana, it could be anything you want it to be. This is your world. That being said, in my world, I like to make sure that when you handle things like boards, you be extra careful not to touch anything you don't need to. Try to handle everything by the edge, like so. Now, we have these special mats, thank you, Happy Banana. We have these special work mats here that make sure that everything's gripped so nothing slides around a whole lot, and also ESD safe as well, so we can't conduct and create any electricity in our workspace, which is very important.
So why is ESD, or what can ESD do to motherboards and components like that?
ESD can do a lot of really strange things to boards. In particular, it can make boards appear as if they're failing when really, they're not failing from any particular point. And it's very difficult to diagnose ESD failure simply because it's not replicatable in any one issue. So maybe you'll have memory errors one day and the next it just simply won't power up properly, or it won't even post, or it'll just randomly shut down. I mean, that's the difficult thing about ESD, is it's near impossible for you to be able to determine that it's ESD damage. It's usually somebody that just has all the experience in the industry and with working with PCs, or you can say, well, this isn't a consistent point of failure. It's got to be ESD.
Yeah, and how much do those straps cost if you need to get one?
$5.
Oh, geez.
Minimum $5. You can buy packs of 3 of them on Amazon for $12 if you feel like you need some redundancy. We have these things by the droves just in case, you never know. We also have a couple of extra redundancies as well in terms of ESD coats. We have ESD foot straps if need be, but really, anybody who's built PCs and has experience can agree that really a good wrist strap is all you need, and it's going to do the same thing for you.
Absolutely.
So let's go ahead and get started by unboxing the Ryzen CPU in this build. Again, if you want to know the kind of specifications for this build that we're working in, you can see the build specs in the bottom right below. So let's go ahead and pull this chip out, and let's bear in mind that as opposed to Intel chips, these chips have the pins on them. So you want to be particularly careful when you pull it out of the case here. I like to set it down, be very careful when opening it with the pins up. That way, in case if it does happen to slip out of your hands, you're not doing any damage if it falls down in the IHS. So, a lot of times what you'll see is when you're looking at these sockets, they got little arrows to tell you where to put them. So you just got to be very careful to pay attention to those arrows. Make sure you're putting them all in the right orientation, and then everyone's in good shape. If the arrows aren't good enough, usually you can see these CPUs have little shapes at the edge. This one's diagonal in all 3 corners except for one that's square. So if you look at the socket, you can see the same thing and line it up appropriately. Now notice that I pulled this locking latch upward because that unlocks the AMD AM4 socket. For you to slide that CPU right in, like so, and then lock it right down like that. Just like this. Just like this. Okay. Now we'll go ahead and move to memory. Should also state that it's very good practice for the sake of saving time and due to the way that these components were handled. A lot of times what you want to do before you even get to the point of installing the components in the case is you'll want to go ahead and do what's called a post test. So that means that you'll get the board with all the major components loaded as minimal as possible, plug a power supply into it and boot it up and make sure it posts. That very rarely, I'd say maybe 1 in every 50 PCs we build will have a problem with post. It's usually something that's minor, that's correctable on the site, but again, in the interest of saving time with this live stream, we're just going to go ahead and pop it in. So let's go ahead and get the memory installed. Very simple to do. You'll notice that boards typically have color coding based on the channel. So you see here, this is a dual channel board as it relates to memory. So you have 2 black and 2 gray. So essentially what that means is if you have a kit of 2 like we do here today, you're going to go ahead and put the memory in either all black or all gray. So let's go ahead and do that. Also, being as most DDR modules, you'll usually have a long side and a short side. So you want to pay attention to the orientation of the DIMM slots and make sure that they're put in the correct orientation so you're not pushing down on them unnecessarily and possibly breaking something on the board or even hurting the memory. You want happy memory. You don't want to hurt your memory. You want to make sure that it supports your PC in the way that you need it to. All right. So we got that locked in place. We can actually go ahead and mount the CPU cooler.
Ooh. What kind of CPU cooler do we have today?
Well, we're going to go ahead and use the stock AMD Wraith cooler that comes with Ryzen processors. It's a fairly good cooler, actually, in the ways in which it does a pretty good job at cooling things by default. I'll show you the size of this thing because it's a big little devil.
Yes, it is.
I don't even want to call it a little devil. I just want to say, man, look at the size of that one.
Can beat the heat out of it.
Oh, you can go and beat the devil out of it. That's for sure. Well, you don't really want to beat the devil out of it. You want to treat it nicely and make sure it's taken care of.
But it's the devil.
Not everything's the devil, Sean. Don't listen to what Mama says. She didn't create electricity.
You don't know
Ben
that.
Franklin did.
Oh. But she's good with kites.
And just know that alligators aren't ornery because they got all them teeth and no toothbrush.
Is foosball for the devil?
So as you can see, the size of this CPU cooler is just mammoth. Look at that. All sides. It's a pretty CPU cooler for it being retail and boxed, but fairly simple to install.
What's that sitting on the underside of it?
One thing to point out is that a lot of retail box CPU coolers that are bundled with CPUs have pre-installed thermal grease or thermal paste. otherwise known as, does a good job as long as you're not doing any overclocking or putting it in any kind of extreme conditions. You can go ahead and just proceed as is. I will say though, here at AVADirect, we do happen to use a lot of the innovation cooling thermal compound that you see here. Always carry a tube with me no matter what. Carry it in the car, carry it at home, carry it in my pocket in case I decide to go out for a nice lunch. You never know.
Goes really well with fries.
And bananas. Banana fries, my favorite. So the way that these AM4 sockets work is they're based on a kind of a leverage and pulley pressure system.
Do we maybe want to lift the board up so they can see that AM4 mounting point?
The AM4 mounting point is something that a lot of people are familiar with. So you can see here, and notice, I'm holding the board by the edges, not touching any of the chips or anything I need to. So you can see
right there.
Black point there, that's the bottom.
And that's the top.
And that's the top. And you can see those tiny little ridges. I don't know how well you can see it, but there's tiny little ridges.
Teeth that kind of poke out.
Poke out and keep
like
it in
that.
place. Hey, I like the look of the front camera, just sitting here holding components up in the air like a bunch of crazies. I swear we're not crazies, we're just PC enthusiasts that love to build things.
You start singing the Lion King theme song.
I feel like that's been done before recently.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the way the lever works is you're going to tighten it down once you put them in place, and it's going to pull up and lock it down. One very important thing to note is make very sure that once you put that CPU cooler in place, you try not to move it around a whole lot. Not a whole lot.
Why is that?
Well, you'll start to smear the thermal paste in such a way that you'll start to create bubbles. And if you create air bubbles, it's a bad thing because it's going to reduce the capability in which it's able to pull the heat off of the CPU. So go ahead and pull that down, get that in place. Sometimes you got to put a little bit of pressure on it to get it in place, but not a whole lot. Be a little bit of trouble sometimes. Just got to be patient with it. Just got to be patient. While I'm doing this, Sean, why don't you tell the folks a little bit about what you like so much about Fractal design cases?
Fractal is probably one of the more popular professional grade cases that we see here a lot. They have a pretty big product line, but the hallmarks of Fractal's products are pretty consistent. Almost all of their systems have some sound dampening features built into them. A lot of them have sound dampening material baked into the cases, which is usually something that runs, I don't know, 40 or 50 bucks per case. They do built in. They use a lot of high quality materials. Like even this, which is one of their lower priced cases, still has better construction than a lot of the other cases you'd see around the same price point. So Fractal tends to just have a great build quality and some sound dampening material that makes it popular with consumers. As far as my opinion on it goes, is they're really easy to build in, which is greatly appreciated, especially with how many systems that we see. The features that they do, like right here, how they have these cable management openings set right kind of where the board's going to sit, just means that your cable management, it's a lot easier to make it look nicer. If you flip it over here, so you see on the back, up here is where those 2.5-inch drives that Joe was talking about earlier go. So we'll end up mounting that crucial drive on this plate right here, and it'll sit right behind the motherboard. A lot of their cases also have down here, they have these big PSU shrouds, which means if you're dealing with a non-modular power supply, like the one we're dealing with today, all of those extra cables and everything that's kind of just hanging out and sitting around stays nice and tucked, and you never really see it.
Definitely need to make sure it's all nice and tucked.
All nice and tucked.
Nice and tucked. So now that we got the CPU cooler back on, it's just a little bit of trouble. Turns out I had to use the other side first, make it a little bit easier. We're going to make our job a little bit easier in terms of wire management. See, sometimes you get these long cables for the CPU cooler. They lead from the CPU cooler to the board right here. This doesn't really appear like it's long enough to really warrant a zip tie. So what you can actually do in a very neat manner is tuck this right below the CPU cooler like this.
Now, where'd you plug that in on the motherboard?
Like now, what you do for CPU coolers is you typically want to plug these into the CPU header. A lot of motherboards have an optional CPU header that is a secondary. Sometimes what you do is you get CPU coolers that will have what's known as a push-pull configuration. You got a CPU fan that pushes the air through and then a secondary that pulls it through the CPU heatsink, because you're going to have resistance when you're pushing air through a heatsink, as to where pulling is going to have less resistance, but it has less cooling effectiveness in some cases. It depends on the design of the CPU heatsink and the fin density specifically. So in this case, we just have one fan. It is designed to blow air down through the fans of the heatsink, and some would argue that this is ineffective in the way in which it affects the thermals of a board if you got a board that's a little temperamental about the way that it cools things. But we should be okay here. No big deal. So now that we have the CPU cooler mounted, the CPU installed, and the memory, we're going to go ahead and install the back plate for our motherboard. Otherwise known as the I/O panel, back plate, whatever you want to call it. This is your world. You can call them whatever you want. This is your place to be happy. Right, Mr. Happy Banana?
Oh, yeah.
Now, you'll want to make sure that you install the I/O panel in the correct orientation, because nothing's worse than putting this board in and you got everything backwards and you got to start all over.
Let's see if we can do this.
So, what we're going to do is we're going to install the I/O panel in this fashion, right? Make sure that it lines up perfectly. And it's a fairly simple process. Sometimes it requires a little bit of doing, a little bit. Just a little bit of doing. There we go. Right in place. Make sure it's flush all around, right? And it's going to stay there. This is where the boards live. Come get you one. So, now what you'll see, kind of a little bit difficult to see, ironically, you'll want to line the board up with the standoffs. And it actually looks like this particular fractal case does not have the standoffs pre-installed, so we're going to go ahead and do that. Oh, look at Mr. Happy Banana. Already on the job. That's probably why he's so happy.
So why weren't all the standoffs installed?
Well, in a lot of these cases, you see that it supports multiple form factors. Typically, a lot of cases are backward compatible with smaller form factors. So we have here an ATX, and that would be backward compatible with micro ATX, or if you really want to do it, mini ATX. That's going to use fewer standoffs. So a lot of case manufacturers don't want to assume that you're using a particular form factor. They're going to go ahead and let you put those standoffs in yourself.
Oh, that makes sense.
It does. A little extra work, but less work for the people that have to take standoffs off if they're going to use a smaller motherboard. So that all depends on you and your outlook. Let's go ahead and put these standoffs in. Make sure they're in place, right? Now you notice I'm just kind of getting started with my fingers. I'm going to finish them up with the standoff tool that came with. That's going to make it real simple, because a lot of times these case manufacturers, they mill these threads to be, you know,
Kind of hard to see.
fairly tolerable in a manner of speaking. So that tool makes it real easy to thread properly and also not damage anything in the process. Thank you, Mr. Happy Banana.
Oh, no problem.
All right. So just a little bit of a turn. You want to stop once you start to get some resistance, and then just a quarter turn to the right. Make sure it's in snug, but not too much. Definitely not too much. I've seen way too many people that overthread standoff, and then you're in a whole world of trouble. All because you couldn't be patient.
Yeah, quarter turn past hand snug. That's really about it. You don't need to do anything too intense.
That's the goal. You can kind of notice that I'm keeping both hands on the screwdriver, one on this standoff tool and one on the screwdriver itself most of the times that I'm moving it around, because ain't nothing worse than working on a system and you drop a small piece of whatever it is that you're working on in the system, and man, now you're trying to shake that case 3 ways till Sunday to find that small piece. So better safe than sorry. Use 2 hands if you can.
Absolutely. Especially how small these screws are.
Oh yeah. Small little screws. There we go. That one's in place. We're good. All right. Now, look at this. Talking about both hands on the tool, and I'm already dropping one. Just practice what I preach, huh? Now, you notice you're going to want to go ahead and get yourself one of these gloves if you don't. They're not needed, but I like to use them for, particularly for holding this point, or this point holding the board, right? Just because there's parts of the board you're going to have to grab, and I don't feel comfortable doing it with bare hands because ESD, but you notice these gloves kind of tend to stick together. So if you ever want to make it real easy to put them on, just pull them tight and beat the devil out of it. So we'll go ahead and put that glove on. Make sure it's nice. Okay. Now a trick we can do, depending on the design of your CPU cooler, if it's safe, with very little detriment to your build, you can actually hold onto the board from the CPU cooler to be able to drop it in nice and slow. Just like that. I like to angle it just a little bit just to avoid those standoffs. You don't want to scrape the board in any of those standoffs because, well, then you're eating into the silicone and looking at a whole other world of issues. So I'm going to adjust it a little bit, and there we go.
Now what are you doing right now?
Now, so what I'm doing is I'm putting a little bit of pressure on that I/O panel because a lot of them have little tabs that are designed to touch some of these ports and ground those ports to prevent any kind of interference or issues with static discharge and things of that nature.
The HDMI is getting a little caught, doesn't it?
The HDMI does appear to be just a little bit caught, so the way to remedy that is pull out the board just a little. You're going to take these tabs, kind of pull up on them just a pinch. Just a pinch. And basically try again. Try it at an angle so it doesn't get caught. Just like that. And there we go.
Now why is it so important to check this now during the build?
Well, if you happen to catch this after the fact that you've put all the time and effort into, well, putting the screws through the standoffs and mounting the board in appropriately, and you're just creating a lot more work for yourself then. I think it's the last thing anybody wants to do.
Yeah,
Create more work for themselves.
Having to take a board out just because one of your HDMI ports isn't quite working properly is never the most fun.
Oh, no, definitely not. Something else I'll point out that'll make your life a heck of a lot easier. We have here a tool that will magnetize and demagnetize items based on what you need it to do. So we're going to go ahead, take this screwdriver here. We're going to put it in the magnetized slot. Just sit here and a couple of turns, right? That way it sticks to your Phillips screws. No problems.
And while Joe gets started on that,
No problems.
and starts getting motherboard screws put in, I'm going to go ahead and take this SSD and mount it to this back plate.
That's a good thinking, Happy Banana.
If you can see this, here we go. So yeah, this is the back plate that we were talking about. It's a little hard to see because it's black. This is going to sit on the back side of the system, directly behind where the motherboard and CPU sit. And then this is just our 2.5-inch Crucial SSD that we are going to mount to this. Those two are going to go together almost exactly like that. That way it's nice and easy for us to install it a little bit later. And the way these work is literally there's screw holes both on the sides and on the bottom of these SSDs. Now where you screw it in just kind of matters on what matches up with what you're putting it into in the case. In this specific case, we'll be mounting them to the back.
I think these are actually the screws you need to use.
They are.
These are not the standoff screws. No, sir. Another thing that's important is to make sure that you use the right screws for your standoffs.
There should really never be any resistance.
Nope. Or it shouldn't be too easy.
Exactly.
That's for sure. There we go. Hopefully you're lucky and you don't cross thread and you can pull it right out and start over with the right screws. Wherever they may be. Looks like these are going to be it. I hope. Let's give this another shot. The proper screws. There it is. There it is. Again, quarter turn rule. Really don't want to use any power tools on builds if you don't have to. It's okay if you want to speed it up. Just make sure that if you're using a drill, you do something that's got a low torque setting. That way you're not cross-threading or creating any problems. Problems that are going to be a lot more difficult to fix than backing out a screw.
Oops. As I'm throwing screwdrivers over here.
Throwing screwdrivers at things. That's just Sean beating the devil out of it.
Beating the devil out of it. All right, actually, I want to show you guys what you can see on this one. I only got 3 out of those 4 screws in right now. Let's see. And you can see how once I got just the first one in, all these holes lined up exactly. There was no, I didn't have to bend, didn't have to do anything like that. When you're mounting SSDs, HDDs, any drives, everything will match up exactly. If it doesn't, that's probably not where the drive goes.
No modifications needed. Although, if you have something special in mind and you want it to mount in a way that it shouldn't, you can always call us. We'll make it happen for you. And if we can't make it happen, we'll give you somebody that can make it happen for you. But that's a very rare occurrence, my friends.
Oh, yeah.
Very rare. All right. So, we have the board mounted. We're going to go ahead and do the next most important portion. And that's installing the graphics card.
Ooh.
Man, this graphics card's a real treat, let me tell you.
Yeah, what do we have today?
Well, a lot of people may have heard of these new cards that are coming out, the RTX cards. Right?
The what?
The GeForce RTX cards.
There's new NVIDIA cards coming out?
Oh, yes. Oh, they're out, my friend.
Oh, my.
They're out. It's not a GTX card. Oh, no. These are RTX cards.
Whoa.
RTX specifically due to the fact that they specialize in a new form of real-time processing called ray tracing.
The name makes sense.
And as you can see here, we have this RTX 2080 by gigabyte.
Ooh.
Nice and pretty. Nice and pretty. Go ahead and drop that in. You notice it's got some covers on things that you may or may not use in the future. We're going to go ahead and keep this on simply because it's not something that was purchased with the PC. We're not going to assume that that's something that the customer is going to use. So we're just going to keep that cover on for them to prevent dust buildup and such, and let them make that choice.
And those pieces that Joe pulled out before he installed the card of the case, this is an expansion slot cover. You'll have anywhere between about 2 and 8 or 9 of these in cases, depending on the size. And then this right here is the thumb screw. Now, because he's putting the card in there, the expansion cover, that's going to go, we'll put it in the accessory box and send it along to the customer. In your case, you usually can just toss this. You probably won't ever need it again. This right here, though, is the thumb screw, which he is going to use once he finishes getting the card mounted to actually secure it to the case itself.
Go ahead, put that in there, make sure the card's nice and secure. It's okay if you want to turn these a little more than usual compared to the board screws because, well, got yourself a heavy graphics card, and especially with us shipping systems, want to make sure it's nice and secure. Can't really overturn expansion slot screws unless you really want to overturn them. There we go. There we go.
Nice and snug. Card's not moving a whole lot.
Not at all. So this is a cable that you could actually, if you wanted to, you could actually use a zip tie on this little devil.
So what's that cable connected to?
This cable's connected to the rear fan right next to it. That, my friend, is going to plug right into the board. Some cases have a fan controller, which you could integrate all these fans into and plug them into. But this one in particular, we're going to go ahead and just plug it right onto the board.
Now, we put the CPU fan on a CPU fan header. Is there specific headers for different fans?
These are usually on channels. So you have CPU channel 1, channel 2, channel 3. Some of them are chassis fans. Some of them are auxiliary fans. Every board manufacturer is different. A lot of them use PWM now.
What's that mean?
It's phase-controlled fans. So essentially, it's a much more accurate measure of changing RPMs rather than just changing it by flat decibels. Let's say 1 volt, 2 volt, 3 volt. PWM will allow you to change it down to the millivolt, essentially. Vary it in much smaller and larger increments if need be.
And then something, while he's doing that, if you look here, this is the motherboard manual. In almost every case, you can get these online and in the box. But essentially over here, what we're looking at, this is page 1-2 of the X470 Plus game, if you want to take a look. Essentially, that's just a block diagram of where everything's at on the board. So as we're going here, what Joe's talking about up here, those are labeled as chassis fans, and then the CPU fans also labeled up here. So if the board that you're building in doesn't have silkscreen titles like CPU fan right next to the actual header itself, you can always go to the manual and look it up here.
Very useful tool to have that motherboard manual, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
This one's doesn't have to look too pretty. So we're gonna go ahead and tuck this right behind the fan.
Tucking's important.
Tucking is very important. So you can see, you tuck that right behind the fan. So all you have is one cable going right behind, and call it a day. Simple as that.
Something that's a very good idea is just to spin the fan a little bit. A lot of times you'll get a cable caught in there, and it'll start making a horrible noise when you start it up. So
make sure
spin it
that
freehand a little bit real quick, just to make sure.
Make sure that fan's free of anything, debris, dust.
The devil.
We definitely want to make sure it's free of the devil. John here says, hey Bob, we're in the computer. Would you describe the happy family? Well, I would say probably the happiest portion of this build, it's got to be that RTX card. Interesting too, because if you look at the pinout, you'll notice that it's not short of just 6. It's actually got a full 8-pin header on both sides, and that just blocked off 2 of them to make it a 6. So my guess is that they're probably using this to be able to appropriate it in the future. Same model, different power requirements. Maybe they'll have an overclock version, who knows? We're just going to have to wait to see. Now, much like the rear chassis fan, we're going to have a front chassis fan in which it's likely already on the back side, so we're going to go ahead and reroute that either through here on the side or on the bottom or maybe on the top. Make sure this is plugged in and working too.
So you don't have to put it through a specific one?
No, it's basically all up to your own choice. So
this is your build. You can do whatever you want with it.
This is your build. You're the creator. You're going to paint a picture on this PC, which is a canvas. Pretend the PC is your canvas, and it's your world. As long as you're happy with it, it's all that matters. Gotta be happy with it.
I need a little bit of Van Dyke Brown for mine.
Oh, I would recommend the Prussian blue.
Now, what'd you just take off there?
I took off the PSU rear plate. Not all cases have this. Some cases do and some cases don't. Basically, what this allows you to do is mount the power supply to this, put it in the case, and then secure this bracket to the case itself. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Make sure you pay attention to the orientation in which you removed it. This is the way it was, just like this. So I'm going to keep it that way when I mount the power supply to it and the appropriate orientation.
Now, how do you know which way to put the power supply in there?
You want to put the power supply in a manner in which it vents most. So this case in particular has vents on the bottom. And the way power supply fans work is they're going to pull air into the power supply from that fan and exit the rear. So if you have a case that doesn't have a vent on the bottom or a vent on the top, depending on the design of your case, you're going to want to actually flip it upside down, and you're going to want to pull ambient air from within the case outside. Now, you think that maybe the ambient air would cause a problem, but oftentimes, as long as you're not turning your PC into an oven, you really have nothing to concern yourself with.
We should start a line of easy bake PCs.
Easy bake PCs would be something very appealing. Now you're making me hungry. You should probably take a couple steps away from me, Happy Banana. If you know what I mean.
I don't want to get peeled.
I wouldn't say appeal you, but maybe a nibble. All right. All jokes aside, let's go ahead and get this power supply mounted. I'm going to use fractal screws to mount this. Make it look kind of a little bit more matching. You could use your typical hexagon screws if you wanted to. They come bundled with the power supply, but I typically prefer that we use the case manufacturer screws because then everything kind of looks similar in design.
Yeah,
Nothing, it's a little bit different.
I don't know if you can see that very well. Standard ones have kind of a hex head look to them. What Joe's doing is he's taking spare screws that we had left over from the case. These cases almost always come with like half a dozen of each specific screw extra. Make sure you hang on to those. They can be really useful like a year or two down the road. But what he's doing is he's using those spare ones once we're done using what they're mainly for, which is getting that board in. He's going to use those so that it looks nice and clean. That does not have any effect in any way, shape, or form on performance or anything like that, does it, Joe?
No. As long as it's secure and it turns and it keeps the power supply in its place, we're in good shape. Real good shape. All right. Turning and turning. And there we go. Nice and secure, no movement. Now, you're going to see power supplies that are either non-modular, fully modular, or semi-modular. And this power supply is semi-modular. And that means that there's always going to be one cable out of the power supply that's connected regardless of your configuration. And in this place, or in this situation, you're looking at the 24-pin, which every PC needs a 24-pin. Semi-modular in this situation makes sense. Because you never want to disconnect the 24-pin to begin with, unless, of course, if you're at a point of power supply failure and you want to replace it with something that's identical, it's useful. But still, only having to disconnect and cut a few sets of wires from your wire management to get to that 24-pin is a lot better than everything.
Oh, absolutely.
A lot better than everything.
And the other nice thing with these PSUs is any cable or any connector that you don't need just doesn't go in the build. With non-mod power supplies, if you're not using, for instance, like your Molex connectors, which is an older style, it's not in use nearly as much, but it is still in a lot of power supplies. You can just leave those unplugged. You don't have to put them on the PSU. You save a little bit of weight in your build and a whole lot of, it looks a whole lot easier for cable management and looks a whole lot better.
Now we can go ahead and put that SSD in place, the manner in which that you installed it, and slide that into the bracket here. Keep forgetting that I got cameras on me. I should probably go and lay this down for people to see, right?
Would be a good idea. Now, something to point out is when I mounted this was a little hard to show you before. See how fractals are written there? There is an upside down and a right side up on these. So if you notice, the way this is going to sit in here, the connectors right here, which is where the SSD actually will connect to the system, are on the bottom. That's not necessarily going to be a game changer, but when we get a little bit later into doing cable management, that's going to allow us to just bring those cables, which are going to start from the bottom of the case, straight up instead of having to go up and around. Now while Joe's over there getting cables ready for the PSU, the way the 2.5-inch mounts on this is literally once we have it there, you slide it in on the side, and then this is just a thumb screw.
You're a thumb screw.
Sir.
There, I said it.
Can't work with this man anymore.
I can't work with this fruit anymore. And I don't mean that figuratively.
All right, while he's over there, so since we got the motherboard mounted and we don't have any HDDs, now HDD screws can look very, very different.
What exactly is an HDD?
HDD is one of the types of storage we deal with that's hard disk drive or mechanical drive.
Say that 3 times fast.
No. And they have, in this case specifically, they have bigger screws like this, which, if what Joe was pointing out a little bit earlier, was down here. So these are other drive bays. These are for 3.5-inch drives. And then you actually notice, see how those has these 4 holes? You can also put 2.5-inch, just like we did up here in it. But what these are is when you're putting in like your big 4 or 6 terabyte rated drives, or you're doing a lot of storage, a lot of music, movie, stuff like that. You mount the drives here using those screws, and then you slide them into these trays. Since we're done doing that, we don't have to mount any more drives, I'm going to go ahead and take all this extra fractal stuff, put it back in the bags, back in the box, and then set it aside for later. Because in our case, we're going to save it and pass it along to the customer, but in your case, you should just keep it and have it, because that's always a good idea.
Gotta keep it handy. Always gotta keep it handy. Now you can see here I'm already starting to set up some of my wire management, right? So I'm going to go ahead and snake that through what the 24 pin is going to be anyway. We got this whole bottom bay to work with. No storage drives down there. That's for sure.
Now the cable Joe's grabbing now is, remember he talked a couple minutes ago about the fan on the front and how the cable was coming around through the back. All he's doing here is he's taking it from where it's running now and pushing it back up through into the front of the case so we can get it attached to that motherboard.
Kind of jumped the gun here a little bit with the power supply because I can't get to any of the cables that I got to plug in. So this is why it's important to keep things in mind when you're building, because don't want to have to go back and forth doing the same stuff over and over and over again.
This is something else nice about these fractal cases, and I think a couple Corsairs do it, is instead of having to undo all 4 screws, which would be a real pain, all Joe had to do was do a couple turns on some thumb screws to get access to it.
Just the 2. So we'll go ahead and plug in everything we need. I try to keep all the cables plugged in within the top row or the bottom row. That's entirely your decision. It doesn't matter either way. It's more or less for the organization of things.
So the first pin, or the first one he got is the CPU or 8-pin EPS connector. This is in every build. Just like that 24-pin, you are always going to have some kind of CPU power, and it's almost always going to be 8-pin. On some of your like server boards and higher end stuff, you might have an extra 8-pin or an extra 4, but there will almost always be at least one.
Always one fork knife.
What else did you connect there? Looks
Always
like
one.
SATA power.
Got the VGA, we got SATA.
SATA power is going to be used to power the SSD here, and then
Well,
VGA.
wouldn't you need power for all SSDs, Sean? Or are we missing something here?
Well, you would not need a power cable for M2 SSDs or PCIe add-on SSDs, which are becoming more and more prevalent, specifically M2s. But in terms of price, the 2.5-inch SSD is probably still king, or is still king, still in use in a lot of builds, especially notebooks.
Notebooks are particularly useful for the fact that even though SSDs are non-moving parts, it's still less physical movement in parts itself, a lot leaner, less weight, even though SSDs really aren't that heavy to begin with compared to hard disks, but still.
Now in M2s, I don't think we have one here, but they are only about that big, and rather than sit in the case and then you have to plug them in, this you have a SATA and then SATA power. Those actually will slot in similarly to the graphics card. They will slide right into the board, and then you put one screw in and they get their own power and data throughput through the exact same slot.
Now
what are you doing there?
What I'm doing is I'm trying to figure out a good way to snake this EPS cable so it's nice and clean. The more traditional way is you kind of tuck it in this fashion, right? Let it go its own way. We'll see if we can get away with that. So it's going to work out
Call it
best.
another lonely day?
You can definitely call it another lonely day. Sigh. And hey, look at this. Since the SATA cable's got to go to the same home, we can pretty much let it follow the same path.
Yeah, and something interesting that Joe's doing is if you notice, kind of looking at this cable, compared to something like, say, these cables, which we'll get to a little bit later, the power supply cables are a lot thicker. There's a lot more to them, and they can be a little bit harder to work with. So what Joe's kind of doing now is he's taking those big PSU cables and he's just getting where they're going to sit in the case done before he gets to the smaller ones. Because what that's going to do is that's going to prevent him from having to go and try and wrestle with these cables when there's a bunch of other stuff in the way.
You can kind of already see that I'm starting to see the ways that I can complete the wire management. It's not going to be the most pretty. Not going to be the most pretty, but that's okay.
And can they see the mount points for
Certainly.
supplies?
It's certainly not on the verge of the worst wire management we've seen. See what I did there?
We would need a couple more tubes of thermal paste.
At least 3 more. There's a nice little build video that Dave Alcock from AlphaCool did to show the kinds of thermal paste application on par with the way the Verve did. And man, it was just outstanding.
Yeah, so what Joe's doing here is he's kind of bringing the cables from the back where the PSU is, and he's pushing them through the front. Now, he put the VGA in this slot right here and the motherboard in this slot. Until you do a couple builds, that's not something that you'll know just looking from the back. So a lot of times when we're doing these builds, we'll have it sitting up on the feet, and you'll look on the back, look on the right, and then slide it through. Since Joe's done this so many times and worked with this case and motherboard a decent amount, he kind of knows where they're going to sit.
So many times. Oh, so close. I was hoping I'd be able to get away with snaking this 3.0 cable through here. And
yeah, you can get a little extra right here.
Probably could. No, it's more or less. Should I do it? Let's see.
Yeah.
I'm going to see where this 3-pin header ends up being. Oh, it's right there. For the sake of wire management, I'm going to do it. So, what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to remove the power supply a 3rd time to be able to get this 3.0 cable. Excuse me.
Yeah, and here, what he's doing is right here on the PSU, there's that cover shroud that we were talking about earlier. There's a couple holes in it, so what he's doing is he's getting that out of the way so that he can try and fit a cable up through and make it nice and clean.
Don't think it's going to work.
No?
Not enough slack, and certainly not into destroying things for the sake of wire management, so.
No, and it's important to have
We're going to
slack.
go ahead and
when
back
you get
off.
Fan headers, any of these wires, the cable should have at least a little bit of give to it. You never want it to be super taut.
At least a 1/4 inch.
Because what that'll do is that can bend pins, and then over time or in transit, that can cause damage, and that's just a headache nobody wants to deal with.
Really, you never want to have wire management that's so aggressive that it's tugging or pulling on anything. That's just not good for anybody.
Right.
Not for you, not for your PC.
Not for your tech support guy.
No, definitely not for your tech support guy, and I think Sean can attest to that. So by all means, feel free to experiment and give Sean a call anytime you want. He'll fix any single problem you have, even if you created it yourself. You're welcome. Oh, so you're supposed to be the happy little banana, not the snappy little banana.
Boo.
Sean, did you happen to hear that joke? You did. You heard that joke. You're. Some say here that you're the king of dad jokes, Sean.
Well, you know.
You got any new dad jokes for us?
I prefer to be called the grandfather.
You have any grandfather jokes for us?
So a farmer walks up to a cow, slaps him on the udder, and the cow turns around and goes, "Hey, how dare you?"
Well, how dairy is it? That's the best you got.
All right. What do you call, or why does the Norwegian? I don't know why I'm doing your accent. Why does the Norwegian? Or why do Norwegian battleships have barcodes on the side of them, Joe?
I know this one, and I just don't even want to say it.
So when they return to port, they can Scandinavian.
Should have said it in their accent.
I can't do a Norwegian accent. It just ends up. I sound like the Swedish chef. Borg, 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 borg. Can I be Beaker on the next live stream?
Can you even do an impression of Beaker? More. I need more Beaker.
No, that's just the tease. You gotta come back to see it again.
No, I don't want the tease. I want the real thing. That's what I signed up for. That's what I expect. I'm a little scared. But
all right, so what Joe's doing now is going through kind of where that shroud sits on the bottom. I'm trying to talk with my hands here like this in the case. And there's a couple holes put out. One is close to where we'll end up putting the audio header. One is near kind of where the USB headers traditionally are on boards, things like that. So he's just taking those connectors and feeding them through. The biggest piece on those is the end. So once you kind of work that through, the cable pulls through pretty easily in those cases.
I just like to pull the cables through, make sure they're all the way in, and then we can work on the wire management from there.
Right.
So, you can see we got most of our cables through. So I'm going to go ahead and work on plugging each one in individually.
So the one that he's doing right now is a USB 3 header. Nowadays, that's pretty much on every system. They tend to be about yay wide. They will have, and they are, direction does matter. So with the way if you look, there's a little kind of cutout on the one end. You can just go ahead and slide that into the header, and you'll see that there's a matching cutout on the female piece on the motherboard.
Sure wish I had a flashlight. Flashlight be
There.
pretty good right about now.
Now, we usually have flashlights.
Yes, we do. There we go. Gotta make sure this lines up perfectly. There we go. Right in. Be very careful with those headers and pins. It's very easy to bend one pin, and you might get lucky and be able to put it back with your fingernail, and you may not pull the whole housing off, and Bob's no longer your uncle. Now Jesse's your uncle, and you don't want Jesse to be your uncle.
Why not? What's wrong with John Stamos?
Wasn't referring to Full House, Jesse. I was referring to Jezebel.
Beelzebub himself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yee.
All right, now something you'll notice on a couple of these connectors, can you maybe show them on that VGA, how the connectors are split?
So, oftentimes what you'll see here on stock power supply cables, by stock I mean the cables that actually come with the power supply, you'll either have to where they're net wrapped like this 24-pin here, or they're individual wires that are glued together from the factory, and you're going to have on one single cable, you're going to have two, it's called 6 plus 2 cables. So they're going to be 6-pin by default, right, as you can see right here. Or you can add the extra 2 pins if you need it. So it's pretty useful in this case because we have a graphics card that's 8 and 6. So we can go ahead and determine that One's going to be 6, and the other's going to be 8.
And the way most of these cables work is, you see what he's doing now is they kind of have a tooth on the 6-pin and then another one on the 2-pin. And what'll happen,
My gold tooth,
is you slide them in place, and then the connector actually goes together as one piece. So once you slide it together, then you take the whole thing and press it down and on.
Now, really not a fan of these kinds of stock cables because I'm just a stickler for wire management, and not a whole lot you can do with these because of the way they're designed. So I'll probably end up zip tying it like this. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and zip tie it now. It's driving me crazy. Make it look visually appealing about as best as you can. Make it look like it's
RTX 2080 with Ryzen. Is this a 4K machine? 4K
could be
capable. Yeah,
certainly
it depends
4K
on,
capable.
On what our customer's monitor is, really. If you would like to get a 4K, absolutely.
Something else I like to do with zip ties. Some people cut a zip tie and they'll leave that bulkhead right there and tell it's a zip tie. And like to pull that to the back and just make it look like it's a plastic.
Is that easy to see?
Band, really. No, so maybe we can go and use another flashlight, I guess.
Yeah, he's talking if you get a zip tie kind of like this. Once you pull it tight, you almost always want to take your side cutters and you will trim that tail off, get it out of the way. So what he's doing is, rather than let it sit like this, if you turn it, just kind of hides that. Makes it look a little bit cleaner, and that's one of the small tricks that we use to make our builds look nice and professional.
Now Sean, one of our viewers, Bart, is wondering what's the best CPU out of either the 8086 or the 2700X. And I got to say, Bart, that's really all subjective. I mean, both CPUs are going to do it for you. If you're budget conscious, go with the 2700X, which is actually what we're using here. If you want the best CPU for the sake of having the best performance as it relates to whether gaming or otherwise, the 8086 is a good choice. I would say simply get the 8086 simply because it's a limited edition. You're never going to be able to get another processor quite like it that boosts to 5 gigahertz. So I'm a collector. I like to have the best of the best regardless of whether I use it. So I vote 8086.
I'd vote 2700X.
Oh, of course you would.
Only because you can take that extra money and put it towards a better graphics card.
Or
if you're doing a gaming build, you're going to notice that a whole lot more, I think.
Or is it because you're a limp banana? There, I said it. It's okay. I love you just the way you are.
Would you put me in a smoothie?
I would put you in 2 smoothies to savor you forever. Now, can I borrow that flashlight from you again, Sean?
Absolutely.
The reason why I'm asking for a flashlight is simply due to the fact that these boards are laid out in such a manner that they will actually tell you where things go.
Now what he's doing now is the front panel connection. So this is where, this is how the case, the power button on the case talks to the system itself, or talks to the motherboard.
Wow.
So what he's doing is, on each of these, they are small little wires, and they are, there's usually 2 or 2 together, kind of like you see on a power supply cable, or they're separate, and they'll each have silk screened on them what they connect to. So you'll have power button, reset button, HDD activity, so if your hard drive's spinning. So all he's doing is taking those and matching them up with where they go to on the board.
I'm actually going to go ahead and pull this one out and pop it down in here. Because this is the front panel audio, I completely missed the fact that this case doesn't even have 2.0 USB. It's all 3, which is good.
All 3.0.
Which is good.
So what you're doing right now is the audio, right?
That's right.
Audio is one of the, I don't want to say more confusing, but that does screw a lot of our customers up, wouldn't you agree? Or a lot of people up.
What is that?
Audio and USB 2.0 headers, which we don't have any in this build, look almost identical. The way you can tell the difference is they're first,
the missing pin placement.
It'll be silk screened on it 90% of the time. So just read. But the other time is
just
if
use
you
your
look
eyes.
At it,
just use your eyes and everything will be all right. Okay.
Line up the pins visually, because you'll see that the USB 2 and HD audio have a different pin placement, and you can tell pretty quickly which one's which.
So we have power LED first. There it is. Simple fact. If you're ever unsure about the orientation of your front panel cables, some people would argue that it doesn't matter. It's a ground and it's a positive and it's all the same. But believe it or not, there are some boards that simply will not work unless you use the appropriate pin orientation. So typically, word of thumb is rule of thumb is with the letters of the headers themselves face down.
Right.
That's usually the correct orientation.
And so personally, this is one of my least favorite part of the builds. It can be a real pain in the butt.
Sure can.
But if you look again in the manual, use the manual if you're building a system. These are gold mines. There is a diagram right here that actually shows you not only where they should be plugged in, but it'll also tell you positive and negative. So what Joe was talking about earlier, where you want to put the text facing down, is absolutely correct. And if you ever need to confirm or just make sure that you're doing it right, go ahead and consult that manual. It'll tell you exactly what you're looking at.
Consult your manual and your manager. This is the part that's the worst. When you're down to just one in limited space.
Yeah, and if it takes you a couple tries to get the front panel, do not feel bad. It still takes us a couple tries in some cases. But once you get them all plugged in, if you take a look, they'll all kind of sit together. And then what he's going to do after he has it connected is then he's going to pull those cables through and make them look pretty. But it's important to note that he got it plugged in first rather than trying to get it cable managed and then yank it around and pull it in.
So what you want to do, what I like to do, once you get everything plugged in, make sure it's plugged in properly, you're going to want to pull all your cables back as tight as they can go. Make them look visually appealing. Now, I'm a little bit different with the exception of this zip tie right here for the graphics card. You can't really see it in the front camera, so I'll go ahead and lay it down. With the exception of this cable right here that I put a zip tie on to keep those kind of overlapped, I prefer, if necessary, or unless absolutely necessary, to use no zip ties anywhere in the front of the case. None. All in the back, because I believe wholeheartedly if you have the proper wire management, you don't need any zip ties in the front, it's all in the back. So that's my own preference. I'm not knocking anybody that does use zip ties in the front of their chassis and visually, but that's just my own tastes. Everybody's different. Everybody's different.
It's your build. You're the creator.
It's your build.
Do
You're
what
the
you want to do
creator.
now.
Paint a mirror on this canvas.
Now, and so this might seem kind of obvious, but the reason that the cable management is so much more important in the front or on that side is because that's a tempered glass side panel. On most cases nowadays that you see, they'll have a clear side panel and then they'll have either a fogged or a closed side panel like we're seeing with this one, which means, I don't want to say it doesn't matter how good the cables look on the back, but it really doesn't because we're just going to be covering them up with this giant black panel rather than
you're absolutely
being able
right.
to see through it.
You don't even need to have super great wire management in the back, to be honest with you, if it's not see-through. Now, I use a Fantex Evolve case, and that is just absolutely awful because you got tempered glass on both sides.
Right.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
So you got to be on your A game the entire time.
Oh, yes. I may have put that fan header in the incorrect location. I'm going to go ahead and I assumed I'd be able to put it up top, but I'm really not a fan of plugging it into the top because that's where the CPU is. So
You're not a fan of plugging it into the top?
no pun intended. I'm going to go ahead and right here inside. That'll do. That'll do, pig. That'll do. Right here in the auxiliary header. You know, some boards are even so innovative that you can actually label your headers based on the fans that you got installed and the ones that you don't. Quite nice.
Yeah, and if you are getting into overclocking or like to tune your systems at all, you don't have to put the fans on specific headers, but take note of where each header is, because the way, once we get into this system, if we wanted to tune the fans or change those at all, the way that's done is you go into BIOS on the motherboard, and then you adjust based on that header. So say, for instance, we put this back fan on chassis fan 2. In order to make this fan spin faster, slower, or do whatever we wanted to do with it, we would go into the BIOS and then find that chassis fan 2 marker and change it.
Something I didn't even know. Really not necessary, just my own preferences. I took the front panel cables since they're visual, or since they're visible, and I zip tied them together. I don't like to see...
Hey, you want to show them that?
Yeah, the general rule of wire management is it's okay if you have a bundle of cables that are similar in size near one another, but you really don't want a whole bunch of open gaps. So zip ties kind of close the gaps, make those wires look like it's just one body of wires rather than a whole bunch, and
Keeps it nice and clean.
makes it look nice and clean and in factory, which some of the best builds look like they come from a factory, and that's kind of what you want. That's what you want to go for. So go ahead and finish up this wire management as good as I can.
And while he's doing that, I'm going to go over here. Now this is some of the extra pieces that came with that PSU that we put in earlier. If you'll notice, because this is a semi-modular, got a giant bundle of cables sitting here. Oops.
Big old bundle.
Big bundle of cables, along with this one. Out of all of these, the only one that we actually need to use with this build is this guy right here, and that's the power cable. All of these came with the power supply, and because it's a semi-modular and we're not using them, we're going to put those in the box and get them out of here, which means that's saving...
Get them out of here.
If we weren't doing a semi-modular power supply, all of these cables would have to go in with what the cable management he's doing, which means we'd probably end up having to cram all of these right kind of where he's putting that. So the build would get really tight, cable management would become a pain, the system would be heavier, and just in general, if you ever have to work on it, that can be a little bit more difficult too, because you only have one place that you can disconnect.
Naruto. How you doing, Naruto?
Hey, what's
I
up?
want inverted cases because I keep my PC on the left side of my desk. They do exist.
Yes, they do.
They absolutely do exist.
Actually, I believe Cooler Master put out a case not too long ago, in the last couple months.
Not tutu? Are you wearing a tutu?
No, I'm wearing a banana costume, Joe.
I prefer you wore a tutu.
Anyway, the way that they work is, in this case, where we mounted that motherboard is built into the case. It's actually part of the chassis. I forget what it's called. I think it's part of their 700 series from Cooler Master, but the way it works is that actually can be removed. So you can set it up in standard orientation, which is like this, where if you're looking at it from the front, the right side panel is where all your components are going to go behind. You can flip it around so that, exactly like Ruru just mentioned, you can go on the left. Or if you want to get kind of crazy, you can even do a chimney style, which means your input-output's going to be on the top rather than on the side. But that seems to be... That's going to look really cool in some high-end water cooling builds, and otherwise it should just kind of be a neat thing. Nothing too impressive though.
Very neat thing.
Nifty.
Very neat thing. All right, so you can see, not really doing a lot to keep the back super clean, but functional.
And
Functional's okay. Easy to work on in the event you need to work on things again.
Yeah, and what's important too is if you're looking on the back here, you see on this side where he has these extra SATA connections running. He has the open pieces from the cable that aren't being used. You want to lay it so that these are laying flat, because keep in mind in about 15-20 minutes here, what we're going to be doing is we're going to take that side panel and slide it on. If you have those pieces sticking up when they're just sitting on the cable, that can make getting that side panel on a pain and can scratch it up and can compress your cables. It's just something that you want to kind of be cognizant of, because now we're not going to have to worry about that as much.
Oh no. Oh no. So we'll see. Kind of do that backwards. All right. So we're going to go ahead and try to use these straps as much as possible. It looks like because of how tight I pulled the 24 pin, it's going to sit just outside, and that's okay.
Yep. And
that's
something
okay.
to point out what that Joe's doing, even though Joe's done a bunch of these builds, he's trying things, putting it back, trying a different one. This is not something you're going to get right the first try. Screw with it a little bit, mess with it a little bit, play around with it. It's your build.
You're the creator. You're the creator.
I really need to get that on a t-shirt.
Everything's your build.
Can we put that on my banana costume?
This is your banana. You're the creator. Paint a mirror on this banana. Paint me like one of your French bananas. So, again, with these cases, I tend to not make them super clean and tight in terms of wire management, because these straps are designed to make it easy for you to rework on it if need be without having to undo a whole lot. So,
absolutely. And if you notice on this
little
fractal,
messy.
We were talking about a little bit earlier, we were talking about that channel. This is where that pays off, is right here. It's kind of hard to tell on camera, but the back panel actually, or the motherboard panel, indents a little bit, which means we have about that much clearance rather than that much for that front section, which is where a lot of the bulk of our cables are going to go. So rather than have to try and pack them down, get them nice and flat, we have space to kind of lay down a nice chunk of cable and have everything coming off of it. Looks nice and clean.
So you can see the result is I have kind of this bulge of cable right here. I mean, that's okay because it's not tight. It's not hurting anything being right here, but it keeps the rest of the run nice and clean. And bear in mind that you really want to be able to take a look at your build and have a very clear indication of where everything's coming from, where it's going. So if you have to undo anything, you have very clear points of being able to cut. You can see I only used 1, 2, 3 zip ties. Very important if you ever need to redo anything. You're only cutting 1 zip tie or 2 and not 7 or 10 or
35.
Like my own build, close to 15 because, well, I can get a little obsessed. So let's go ahead and put the side panels back on.
Alrighty.
Moment of truth for the rear. If I did a good job with the wire management, it's going to pop right on. If I didn't, we're going to redo it. Well, would you look at that? First time. First time, just not for everything. All right. Okay. You can see all the wire management's still intact. Nothing pulled too tight. Everything nice and clean. No zip ties, except for maybe the one for the fan. But still, you almost can't see a lot of those cables. And that's my own style of wire management. I want to be able to see as very little cable as possible, unless you can't be avoided like the graphics card. But things like the bottom panel cables and the fan cables, hide those suckers. Gotta hide them. Okay. Finish up with the tempered glass screws. Something to note, which I'm sure a lot of you have already noticed, we kept protective plastic on the tempered glass, and that's to prevent us from making little scratches or any dents or blemishes that may just happen as a hazardous job and handling things. We try to use gloves whenever we can, but sometimes little things can happen, happy accidents can happen, and we prefer our customers not be affected by those happy accidents. So, well, there you have it. Our Ryzen 2700X 16 gigabyte RTX 2080 gaming system build. 2080! First time I've broken character the entire live stream, and it was worth it. Again, I want to thank you for joining us on today's live stream. Feel free to like and subscribe to all of our social media channels, YouTube, Twitch, which we do a lot of game streams on, Facebook, Twitter. Instagram. Listen to Happy Banana and listen to Rob Boss. Again, signing off. Thank you for joining us in today's AVADirect live stream.